I got pregnant in 10th grade. My parents disowned me and kicked me out. 20 years later, my name is Ava Monroe, and I am 36 years old. This is the story of how I lost a family and built a life. The rain was falling sideways that night. I was 16, trembling, soaked, and holding a plastic grocery bag with 2 t-shirts and a sonogram photo. Inside, my father's voice thundered, "You've shamed this family! Get out!" My mother didn't look at me. Her hands shook, but she didn't stop him. The door slammed before I could even say goodbye. No suitcase, no coat. Just me, a pregnant teenager standing on the porch in the dark, my breath fogging in the cold air. That was the night I stopped being their daughter. That was the night I became someone they'd one day beg to know. But before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe and drop a comment, where are you watching from? Before that night, I was their pride. I wasn't a person so much as a project. My name was Ava Monroe, and I was the daughter of Richard and Eleanor Monroe, a fact that meant everything in our small corner of Dallas. We lived in a house with a perfectly manicured lawn and tall white columns that looked like they belonged on a government building. Everything in our lives was about appearances. My father owned a high-end furniture business, and my mother organized charity galas. Their friends were people with last names that were also the names of streets and parks. My role in this carefully constructed world was simple: be perfect. And for 16 years, I was. I got straight A's. I played piano, not because I loved music, but because the sight of me at the grand piano during their Christmas party reflected well on them. I volunteered at our church every Sunday, handing out bulletins with a polite smile that I practiced in the mirror. My mother would pick out my clothes. They were always modest, always tasteful, and always a little too mature for my age. "You're representing this family, Ava," she would say, smoothing the collar of a blouse. "Don't forget that." I never did. I felt like a doll they took out of a box for special occasions. They didn't raise me. They polished me for display. Every award I won at school was framed and hung in my father's office. Every compliment I received was repeated at dinner parties. They loved the idea of me. They loved the daughter who would go to an Ivy League school, marry a respectable man, and continue the legacy of the Monroe name. The problem was, I was a person, a real one. Underneath the pressed blouses and the perfect grades was a teenage girl who was curious and sometimes lonely. I met a boy named Lucas. He wasn't from a family with a name on a street sign. He worked at the local movie theater and had a kind smile. He saw me, not my family name. He listened to me, not the list of my accomplishments. With him, I didn't have to be a reflection of my parents. I could just be Ava. One mistake. That's all it took. One night of feeling like a normal teenager made me human. And in my family, human was another word for flawed. I found out I was pregnant on a Tuesday afternoon. The little pink line on the plastic stick felt like a death sentence. I sat on the floor of the drugstore bathroom for an hour, just staring at it. My first thought wasn't about a baby. It was about my father's face, my mother's disappointment, the perfect image shattering into a million pieces. Telling them was the hardest thing I've ever done. I waited until after dinner. My father was reading the newspaper in his leather armchair, and my mother was clearing the porcelain plates. The house was quiet, the way it always was. Silent and heavy. "Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something," I said. My voice was so small it barely made a sound. My father lowered his paper. His eyes, cold and assessing, fixed on me. "What is it, Ava?" My mother stopped in the doorway, her hands clutching a stack of plates. She knew. Mothers always know when the air changes. The words wouldn't come out. I just opened my purse and took out the sonogram photo the clinic had given me. It was a small, grainy black and white picture, a tiny speck. I held it out. My mother gasped and dropped the plates. They shattered on the hardwood floor, the sound echoing through the silent house. My father stood up slowly. He didn't yell, not at first. His voice was dangerously low. "What is this?" he asked, his eyes never leaving mine. "I'm pregnant," I whispered. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. It was a cold, thick silence that sucked all the air out of the room. I saw the calculation in his eyes. He wasn't seeing his daughter. He was seeing a problem, a scandal, a stain on the family name. "You will get rid of it," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. "No," I said, and the word surprised me. It was the first time I had ever truly defied him. I can't. That's when he changed. The cold mask cracked, and raw fury poured out. The yelling started. Words like shame, disgrace, and ruin were thrown at me like stones. He told me I had thrown my future away. He said I had destroyed everything they had worked for. My mother just stood there, surrounded by broken porcelain, crying silently. She didn't defend me. She didn't look at me. She just stared at the floor, as if the mess she had to clean up was the biggest tragedy in the room. That's when he said it. Get out of this house. You are no daughter of mine. He pointed to the door. I begged. I cried. I looked at my mother, pleading with my eyes. Please, Mom, say something. She just shook her head, her hand over her mouth, and turned away. In that moment, I realized the truth. Their love was conditional. It was a prize I had to earn, and I had just been disqualified. So I went to my room, grabbed a plastic grocery bag, and threw in 2 shirts and my toothbrush. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely zip my jeans. I took the sonogram photo with me. It was the only thing in the world that felt like it was truly mine. The front door slammed shut behind me. The sound final. The rain hit my face, mixing with my tears. I stood on that porch, the perfect porch, of the perfect house, and understood I was completely and utterly alone. They told everyone I'd gone to live with my aunt in California for a special academic program. It was a neat, clean lie that kept their image intact. The girl they had polished for 16 years was gone. They had erased me. The truth? I walked for hours in the rain until I found a 24-hour library. The next day, I found an old unlocked Chevy in the back of the parking lot. The seats were cracked and smelled like old coffee. That car became my home for the next month. I wasn't some runaway on an adventure. I was a ghost haunting the edges of a life I used to have. Every night, I would curl up in the back seat, clutching my stomach, feeling the cold seep into my bones. I was terrified. But as the days turned into weeks, a strange feeling started to grow inside me. It felt like steel hardening in my spine. I wasn't just lost. I was learning. I was learning that the world my parents had built was made of glass, and I was learning that I was made of something much, much stronger. The first few weeks were a blur of hunger and fear. I learned to survive. On free water from the library's drinking fountain, and whatever food I could buy with the $27 I had in my pocket when I left home. I learned which city parks had bathrooms that were open early in the morning. I learned how to sleep in the backseat of a car and not panic when police cars drove by, their lights flashing across my face. The library was my sanctuary. I'd spend all day there, reading everything I could get my hands on, trying to forget the cold dread that settled in my stomach every night. I wasn't just a pregnant 16-year-old. I was invisible. People walked past me, their eyes sliding right over me, as if I were a piece of furniture. In a way, it was a relief. No one was looking at me, which meant no one was judging me. After a month of living in the Chevy, my money ran out. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. The baby inside me was a constant reminder that my survival was no longer just about me. I had to do something. I started walking from business to business, asking for work. I was turned away from a dozen places. I was too young. I had no experience. I had no address. My belly wasn't showing yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time. The rejections felt like tiny cuts, each one stinging more than the last. Finally, I walked into a small 24-hour diner called the Corner Booth. It smelled like grease, coffee, and desperation. The owner, a tired-looking man named Sal, barely glanced at me. "What do you want, kid?" he grunted, wiping down the counter with a rag. "I'm looking for a job," I said, my voice shaking a little. "I'll do anything. Wash dishes, bus tables. I'm a hard worker." He looked me up and down. "You got a place to live? You got parents who know where you are?" I lied. "Yes, sir. I live with my aunt just a few blocks away." He must have seen the desperation in my eyes because he sighed and threw the rag into a bucket. "Fine. Night shift. $10 an hour. Cash. You wash dishes. Don't be late. Don't steal, and don't cause trouble." That night I started my first real job. The kitchen was hot and loud. Piles of dirty dishes seemed to regenerate the second I turned my back. But it was the most beautiful place in the world to me. It was a paycheck. It was a purpose. That's where I met Maribel. She was a cook, a short round woman with kind eyes and a laugh that filled the entire kitchen. She was in her 50s and had been working at the diner for 20 years. She saw right through me. On my third night, the morning sickness hit me hard. I ran to the employee bathroom and was sick for 10 minutes straight. When I came out, pale and shaking, Maribel was waiting for me with a glass of water and a piece of dry toast. "How far along are you, mija?" she asked softly. Tears welled up in my eyes. It was the first time anyone had spoken to me with kindness in over a month. I told her everything. The perfect family, the pregnancy, the night I was kicked out. I expected pity or judgment. Instead, she just nodded. "Men can be fools," she said, putting a warm hand on my shoulder. "And sometimes mothers are too scared to be brave. But you have fight." Maribel became my anchor. She let me nap in the dry storage room on my breaks, when the exhaustion became too much to bear. She would sneak me leftover food to take with me at the end of my shift. She never called me the pregnant girl. She called me Ava or Mija, my daughter. She told me stories about raising her own 3 sons on a cook's salary. "It's not easy," she would say, flipping pancakes on the grill. "But you look at that baby's face, and you find a strength you never knew you had. You'll raise that baby just fine. You've got fight." Her words became my mantra. I repeated them to myself every night as I walked back to the cold Chevy. "You've got fight." I knew a diner job wasn't enough. My parents had always preached the importance of education, and in a strange, twisted way, I was determined to prove them right. I found a program for a high school equivalency degree, a GED. The classes were at night, at a community center across town. My new life became a grueling routine. I'd sleep in the car for a few hours in the morning, spend the afternoon at the library studying, take 2 buses to my GED class, and then take another bus to the diner to work until dawn. I was always tired. My ankles swelled and my back ached constantly. I did my homework on the back of old receipts during my 10-minute breaks at the diner. Some of the other workers looked at me with pity, but I didn't want their pity. I was building something. I finished my GED 2 weeks before my due date. I took the final exam with a belly so big I could barely fit behind the small desk. I passed. I walked out of that community center holding my certificate, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of pride. I had done it, all by myself. When my son Ethan was born, it was in a sterile, impersonal charity ward of the county hospital. I was alone. There were no flowers, no balloons, no proud father waiting outside. It was just me and a handful of overworked nurses. The pain was excruciating, but the moment they placed him on my chest, everything else faded away. He was so small, so perfect. He had a full head of dark hair and tiny wrinkled hands. I looked into his eyes and I saw my future. He was not a mistake. He was not a source of shame. He was my son. I held him close in that quiet, lonely hospital room and whispered a promise to him. "They may have erased me," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "but I'll write my own story. And you, my sweet boy, you will be the best part of it." In that moment, holding my son, I wasn't a scared 16-year-old anymore. I was a mother, and I would do anything to give him the life he deserved. The years that followed were a relentless grind. They were both brutal and beautiful, a strange mixture of exhaustion and profound love. Life with a newborn was a challenge I could never have prepared for. With the money I'd saved from the diner, I was able to rent a tiny one-room apartment in a rundown building. It had a leaky faucet and neighbors who yelled at all hours, but it was ours. It was a home. It had a roof and a door I could lock. After sleeping in a car, it felt like a palace. My days became a carefully managed schedule of survival. I worked the night shift at the diner from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Maribel had helped me find a neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, who would watch Ethan for a few dollars an hour while I worked. I would come home just as the sun was rising, my body aching and my clothes smelling of fried bacon. I'd pick up Ethan, feed him, and try to get a few hours of sleep while he napped. The afternoons were for him. We'd go to the park or read books on the floor of our small room. He was a happy baby, and his laughter was the fuel that kept me going. But I knew this wasn't enough. I wanted more for him. I wanted a life where we weren't always one broken-down car or one missed shift away from disaster. The dream of a better future was a constant hum in the back of my mind. The promise I made to him in that hospital room echoed in my ears every single day. When Ethan slept, my second day began. I didn't have a television or a radio. My only luxury was my library card. I started borrowing books. Not novels, but textbooks. At first, it was just anything to keep my mind sharp. Then, I found the medical section. I started with basic anatomy and physiology. I was fascinated. I read about the human body, about how it fought diseases, how it healed. It felt like I was learning a secret language. These books were my escape, but they were also the blueprint for a new life. I started a mason jar on top of our rickety dresser. I wrote "someday" on a piece of tape and stuck it to the glass. Every night after my shift, I would empty my pockets. Every tip, every spare dollar, every quarter went into that jar. It was a slow process. Some nights I only had a few wrinkled dollar bills to show for 8 hours of work. But watching the money slowly rise, coin by coin, felt like I was building a fortress against the world. When Ethan was 2, the jar was finally full enough. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pay for one class at the local community college. I enrolled in an introductory biology course. It was terrifying. I was older than most of the students, and I felt like an imposter. I was a waitress, a single mom, not a college student. I'd bring Ethan with me to the campus library, where he'd color quietly in a corner while I studied. I did my homework at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning, fighting off sleep, the words in the textbook blurring together. I got an A in that class. Holding that report card felt better than any academic award I had ever received in my old life. This one was mine. I had earned it with exhaustion and sacrifice. One class turned into 2, then a full course load. Life became an even more frantic juggling act. Work, motherhood, and school. There were times I thought I would break. I remember one week when Ethan got a bad ear infection. He was crying all night, and I had a major anatomy final the next day. I sat on the floor of our apartment, holding my feverish son in one arm and my textbook in the other, tears of pure exhaustion streaming down my face. I wanted to quit. I wanted to give up and just resign myself to a life of waiting tables. But then I looked down at Ethan's face, so peaceful in his sleep, and I remembered Maribel's words. "You've got fight." So I wiped my tears, made some coffee, and kept studying. I passed that final. Slowly, painfully, I built a life from the ashes of the one that had been taken from me. I finished my associate's degree. The mason jar paid for that. With those credits, I applied to nursing school. It was a long shot, but I poured every bit of my story, my struggle, and my determination into my application essay. A few months later, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. I was accepted, but the tuition was more money than I had ever seen in my life. I felt my dreams slipping away. That night at the diner, Maribel saw the despair on my face. I told her I had gotten in, but I couldn't afford it. The next day, she came to my apartment with a shoebox full of cash. It was her life savings. "You take this, mija," she said, pressing it into my hands. "You are going to be a nurse. You are going to help people. This is not a gift. It is an investment in a good heart." I cried and told her I couldn't accept it, but she insisted. Her faith in me was a lifeline. Her loan, combined with student loans and every penny I could earn, got me through nursing school. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. The clinical hours were grueling, the coursework was demanding, and the pressure was immense. But for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Then, a miracle happened. During my final year, based on my grades and my story, I was awarded a scholarship, a full ride to finish my Bachelor of Science in Nursing at the University of Texas. The day I got that letter, I held it in my hands and just sobbed. The weight of years of financial struggle lifted off my shoulders. I could finally breathe. By the time I turned 30, I was a registered nurse. I had a degree, a career, and a beautiful, healthy 10-year-old son. We moved into a small 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood. It had a little backyard where Ethan could play. I walked through the empty rooms before we moved our furniture in, the silence feeling peaceful, not lonely. I had done it. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. I was a mother. I was a provider. I was a woman who had built a life, brick by painful brick, from nothing. My career as a nurse was more than just a job. It was a calling. I worked in the emergency room of a large public hospital in Dallas. It was chaotic, loud, and often heartbreaking, but I loved it. I saw people at their most vulnerable, and I found a deep sense of purpose in being the calm, steady presence they needed. But every so often, a particular kind of patient would come in, and it would feel like looking into a mirror. They were always young girls, usually teenagers, with fear in their eyes. They were pregnant, alone, and had nowhere to go. Some had been kicked out of their homes, just like I had. Others were running from abusive situations. They would come to the ER for a minor complaint, but I could see the deeper crisis they were in. They needed more than a prescription. They needed a safe place. They needed a Maribel. I would do what I could. I'd give them information for shelters, connect them with social workers, and sometimes I'd slip them $20 from my own pocket for a meal. But it never felt like enough. I would go home to my comfortable house and my wonderful son, and I would think about those girls out on the street with the same terror I once felt. The memory of sleeping in that cold Chevy was never far from my mind. The idea started as a whisper. A small, persistent thought. What if there was a place? A place that wasn't a sterile, intimidating shelter, but a real home. A place that offered not just a bed, but support. Medical care, child care, job counseling, and most importantly, a community of people who understood. For 2 years, the idea grew. I worked double shifts, saved every penny I could, and lived as frugally as possible. I took business classes at the community college at night. I wrote a business plan at my kitchen table after Ethan was asleep. I talked to doctors, lawyers, and social workers, gathering information and support. The dream was crazy. I was a single mother, a nurse with a mountain of student debt. Who was I to think I could start a nonprofit from scratch? But the image of my 16-year-old self, standing alone in the rain, wouldn't let me go. I was doing this for her. I was building the sanctuary I had desperately needed. At 32, I took the biggest leap of faith of my life. I cashed out my small retirement fund, took out a second mortgage on my house, and combined it with the money Maribel had loaned me all those years ago, which I had paid back with interest, much to her protest. With that seed money, I leased a large old house in a quiet neighborhood. It was run down and needed a lot of work, but I saw its potential. I called it Haven Care Wellness. The first few months were a blur of manual labor and paperwork. I learned how to patch drywall and paint walls. Friends from the hospital and people from my community college came to help. We laid new floors, fixed the plumbing, and furnished the rooms with donated furniture. Every single piece of that house was built with purpose. Every nail hammered felt like I was rewriting a painful piece of my past into something useful, something beautiful. We opened our doors with just 4 beds. Our first resident was a 17-year-old girl named Maya. She was 7 months pregnant and had been sleeping in her car. The night she arrived, I showed her to her room. It was clean and bright with a handmade quilt on the bed. When she saw it, she burst into tears. "No one has ever given me anything so nice," she whispered. "You deserve nice things, Maya," I told her, my own voice thick with emotion. "You deserve to be safe." That was the moment I knew I had done the right thing. Haven Care was more than just a building. It was a promise. It was the answer to a prayer I had whispered into the cold night air 16 years earlier. Word spread. We quickly filled our 4 beds and had a waiting list. We offered prenatal care, parenting classes, therapy, and daycare so the young mothers could finish school or find jobs. I hired other nurses and a social worker. We helped the girls get their GEDs, apply for college, and create resumes. We didn't just give them a place to stay. We gave them the tools to build their own lives, brick by brick, just as I had. By the time I was 35, Haven Care had grown beyond my wildest dreams. We had secured grants and community funding. We moved into a larger facility, a former apartment complex, and could now house 30 mothers and their children. We partnered with hospitals statewide, becoming a primary resource for young women in crisis. In 3 years, we had helped over 1,000 young women find their footing. My face was in local newspapers and on the evening news. I became an advocate, a public speaker, telling a sanitized version of my story to raise money and awareness. I talked about the importance of supporting young mothers, about breaking cycles of poverty and despair. Through all of this, I never once reached out to my parents. I never called. I never wrote. I had no idea if they knew what I was doing, and I found that I didn't care. My need for their approval had died on that rainy porch 20 years ago. My success wasn't for them. It wasn't a performance to win back their love. It was for me, for Ethan, and for every young girl who had ever been told she was a source of shame. My silence was my announcement. I had built a new world for myself, a world they had no part in. And in that world, I was whole. Word travels fast in a city like Dallas if you move in the right circles. But when you fall out of those circles, the silence is what travels faster. I didn't hear about my parents' collapse from a friend or a concerned relative, because I had neither. I learned about it the way a stranger would, through the detached, factual reporting of the local news. It started with a small article in the business section of the Dallas Morning News online. I was drinking my coffee one morning before a shift, scrolling through headlines, when our last name caught my eye. Monroe Fine Furnishings faces insolvency. I clicked the link, my heart giving a strange, dull thud. The article was short, filled with business jargon. Chapter 11. Bankruptcy, creditor lawsuits, leveraged assets. But the story underneath the technical terms was one I knew intimately. A story of pride. My father's business had been his kingdom. It was built on a reputation for old-world quality in a new-world market. But he had refused to adapt. He saw online retailers as a vulgar trend, contemporary design as a fleeting fad. He believed the Monroe name was enough. While other companies streamlined and modernized, he poured more money into lavish showrooms and imported Italian marble for his office floor. He was selling an image, the same image he had demanded from me. The business wasn't just a business. It was a testament to his own perceived superiority. As I read more over the coming weeks, a clearer picture emerged. He had taken out massive loans, not just to prop up the failing company, but to maintain their lifestyle. The country club membership, the European vacations, my mother's charity galas. It was all funded by debt. They were living in a house of cards, and the slightest breeze had brought it all down. I watched from a distance, a silent observer to the slow-motion demolition of the life I once knew. I felt a strange sense of detachment, like a doctor reading a patient's chart. The diagnosis was clear, a terminal case of pride. There was no joy in it. I had expected to feel something, a sense of victory, of schadenfreude, of righteous satisfaction, but I felt nothing of the sort. It was just a quiet, sad confirmation of what I had learned that night in the rain. Their world was hollow. It was built on appearances, and without the money to maintain the facade, there was simply nothing left. One afternoon, I drove past my old neighborhood. I didn't mean to. I was on my way to a meeting across town and took a wrong turn. But there it was, the street with its canopy of ancient oak trees and sprawling lawns. And there was the house. My house. Except it wasn't. There was a large, stark, foreclosed sign hammered into the perfect lawn. The grass was slightly overgrown. The white columns seemed gray and tired. It looked smaller, less imposing. It was just a building, an empty shell that held the ghosts of a family that had never really been one. I didn't stop the car. I just looked at it for a long moment, then kept driving. I didn't feel sadness or loss. I felt free. The prison had finally crumbled. Ethan was 16 then. The same age I had been when I was cast out. He was smart and perceptive, and he knew more than I often gave him credit for. He found me looking at an old photo of the house one evening. "Is that the place you grew up in?" he asked, sitting beside me on the couch. "It was," I said. "I heard some kids at school talking," he said carefully. "Their parents know you're—" "My grandparents. They said they lost their business." I nodded, waiting for his reaction. I had told him the truth about my parents years ago, in simple, age-appropriate terms. He knew they had not wanted me to have him. He knew they had not been a part of our lives by their own choice. I had never spoken of them with anger, only with a quiet sadness for what could have been. "Does that make you happy?" he asked. It was a genuine question from a teenager trying to understand a complex adult emotion. I thought about it for a long moment. "No," I said honestly. "It doesn't make me happy. It just makes me sad for them. They spent their whole lives building something that wasn't real. They valued what things looked like more than what they were. Their business, their friendships, even their family. It was all for show. And when the show was over, everyone left." He put his head on my shoulder. "Well, our house is real. And we're real." "Yes, we are," I whispered, wrapping my arm around my son, my beautiful, real son. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I had everything of value in the entire world. The news of their downfall faded, as all news does. They disappeared from the social pages. My mother's name was no longer on the letterhead of any charity committees. They sold their cars. They moved into a small rental apartment on the other side of town. Their friends, the ones who had smiled so brightly at their dinner parties, stopped returning their calls. They had been erased from the world they had so carefully constructed, just as they had erased me. The irony was not lost on me, but it brought me no comfort. It was just the logical conclusion of a life lived for the approval of others. They had traded their daughter for their reputation, and in the end, they had lost both. It was a Sunday morning, almost 20 years to the day they threw me out. The air in my home was warm and smelled of cinnamon rolls baking in the oven. Ethan, now a high school senior with a full scholarship to college waiting for him, was at the kitchen table, sketching in a notebook and sipping orange juice. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. It was a perfect, peaceful, ordinary moment. The kind of moment I had once thought was impossible for someone like me. Then the doorbell rang. The sound was jarring, an interruption to the quiet harmony of our morning. I figured it was a neighbor or maybe a package delivery. I wiped my flour-dusted hands on my apron and walked to the front door. Through the beveled glass, I saw them. My breath caught in my chest. For a split second, my mind refused to process the image. They were older, so much older. My father's broad shoulders were stooped, his proud posture gone, replaced by a weary slump. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a simple, slightly frayed sport coat. My mother stood close beside him, her hand clutching his arm as if for balance. Her perfectly styled hair was thinner now and gray at the roots. The designer handbag was gone, a plain leather purse slung over her shoulder. They looked like strangers, but I knew them in my bones. They were the ghosts of my past, standing on the doorstep of my present. They looked small and cold and lost. My first instinct was to turn around, to walk back to the kitchen and pretend no one was there. I could lock the door, close the blinds, and they would eventually go away. I could preserve my peace. It was what they deserved. 20 years of silence had been my answer to their cruelty, and it had worked. Why break it now? But my feet stayed planted on the floor. My hand rested on the cool brass of the doorknob. This was my house, my sanctuary. They had no power here. I was not the terrified 16-year-old girl anymore. I was a 36-year-old woman who had built a life, a family, and a future on her own terms. I was not afraid of them. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The cool morning air washed over me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I could see the shock in their eyes. They were looking at me, but they were seeing a woman they did not know. They were seeing someone who was not broken. My father spoke first. His voice, which I remembered as a thunderous command, was now thin, hesitant. "Ava," he said, as if testing the name, as if he wasn't sure it still belonged to me. I just nodded, my expression unreadable. I offered no smile, no warmth. I just waited. We heard about Haven Care, he stammered, his gaze drifting past me to the warm interior of my home. The news. They did a story. We didn't know. You built all that. His words hung in the air between us. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was a statement of awe at my success. The same man who had thrown me out for being a failure was now standing on my porch, impressed by my accomplishments. He wasn't seeing a daughter he had hurt. He was seeing a successful enterprise he couldn't take credit for. My mother's eyes were wet with tears that didn't fall. She looked fragile, a porcelain doll that had finally cracked. "It's wonderful what you've done," she whispered. "Helping all those girls." Then came the real reason for their visit. We'd like to meet our grandson. The request was so audacious, so completely devoid of any understanding of the pain they had caused, that a cold, hard clarity settled over me. They wanted to meet my son, the boy whose existence had been my greatest shame in their eyes, the baby they had ordered me to get rid of. I felt the years of pain, of struggle, of lonely nights and desperate prayers, coalesce into a single quiet point of steel in my soul. I looked directly at my father, then at my mother. My voice, when I spoke, was calm. It was steady. It held no rage, only the weight of an undeniable truth. "You mean the baby you told me to erase?" The words landed in the quiet morning air like stones. I saw them both flinch. My father's gaze dropped to the welcome mat at his feet. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, a silent, choked gasp. The shame was immediate, a dark flush that crept up their necks. For the first time in their lives, they had no response. There were no excuses left. There was no lie they could tell to cover the ugliness of that truth. They stood there in the wreckage of my question, utterly exposed. The power dynamic that had defined my entire childhood, their absolute authority and my terrified obedience, had evaporated. I was the one holding all the cards. A part of me wanted to close the door right then, to leave them standing there with the weight of what they had done. But another part of me, the part that had built Haven Care, the part that believed in facing the truth head-on, knew that wasn't the end of the story. Closure wasn't about running away. It was about standing your ground. I stepped aside, opening the door wider. I looked at their downcast faces, and a new, unfamiliar feeling surfaced. It was not forgiveness. It was a kind of clinical, detached pity. They were broken, and they had come to the person they had shattered, hoping she could fix them. "Come in," I said, my voice even. "Let's see what forgiveness looks like." They walked into my home like trespassers, their steps hesitant on the hardwood floors. I led them through the living room and into the kitchen, the heart of my house. I gestured for them to sit at the kitchen table. It was a simple, sturdy oak table, the first major piece of furniture I had ever bought for myself, purchased with months of saved tips from the diner. It had been Ethan's homework spot, our dinner table, the place where we'd carved pumpkins and decorated Christmas cookies. It was a table that had only ever known warmth and love. Now it felt like a witness stand. I moved around the kitchen with a practiced calm, filling the kettle with water, taking down 3 mugs from the cupboard. The domestic ritual grounded me. My hands were steady. I felt a strange sense of being outside my own body, watching this impossible scene unfold. Here were Richard and Eleanor Monroe, who once hosted dinner parties for the city's elite on fine china, now sitting silently in their estranged daughter's modest kitchen, waiting for her to serve them tea in a ceramic mug that said, "World's Best Mom." The silence was thick with everything that had never been said between us. They looked around the room, at the crayon drawings from Ethan's childhood taped to the refrigerator, at the row of herbs growing on the windowsill, at the comfortable, lived-in reality of a life they had no part in. This home was a language they didn't speak. It was built with things they didn't value: resilience, sacrifice, and unconditional love. Just as the kettle began to whistle, Ethan walked in. He had headphones around his neck and his sketchbook in his hand. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes falling on the 2 strangers at our table. He looked from their unfamiliar, strained faces to mine. At 18, he was tall and lean, with a quiet confidence that was all his own. He had my eyes, but his calm, steady demeanor was a gift he had given himself. "Mom, who's this?" he asked, his voice even. He wasn't accusatory or hostile, just curious. I turned from the counter, my heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. This was him, my son. My greatest achievement. The living, breathing proof that I had made the right choice. "Old memories, honey," I said quietly. Ethan looked at them again, and I could see the understanding dawning in his eyes. He knew. He had seen the 1 or 2 old photographs I kept in a box. He was looking at his grandparents. My father cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. He tried to smile at Ethan. A weak, watery thing that didn't reach his eyes. "Ethan," he began, his voice raspy. We're your grandparents. We made mistakes." It was the closest he could get to an apology. A vague, sweeping admission that cost him nothing. But Ethan didn't react with the anger they might have expected, or the easy forgiveness they might have hoped for. He just tilted his head, his expression one of calm consideration. "Yeah, Mom told me," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "The kind you don't repeat." The simple, profound statement landed with more force than any shout could have. It was not an accusation. It was a lesson learned. It told them that their story was not a secret source of shame in our house, but a cautionary tale, a foundation for our own moral code. It told them that their failure had been transformed into my son's wisdom. My mother, who had been silent until now, began to cry. The tears she had been holding back now streamed down her wrinkled cheeks. She reached a trembling hand across the table, as if to touch Ethan, but let it fall back into her lap. She tried to smile through her tears. "We just want to be part of your lives now," she pleaded softly. "We've missed so much." Ethan's gaze was unwavering, but it was filled with a surprising softness. There was no bitterness in him. I had raised him without it. He looked at these 2 broken people and saw them not as monsters, but as a lesson. "You were part of our lives," Ethan said, his voice so quiet they had to lean in to hear him. "Just not the way you think." He glanced at me, a look of profound love and understanding passing between us. Then he looked back at them. "You taught her how strong she could be. Her whole life, her work. It all started because of you. You showed her exactly what kind of parent she needed to be by showing her what not to be." The truth of his words filled the room, absolute and irrefutable. He had taken their greatest sin, their abandonment, and reframed it not as our tragedy, but as the source of our strength. He had stripped them of their power to hurt us ever again. They hadn't come here to offer an apology. They had come seeking a piece of the life I had built, a share in the grandson they had never known. But my son, in his quiet wisdom, had just shown them that their only contribution to our happiness was their absence. I watched them shrink into their chairs, the weight of his words pressing down on them. My father stared at his hands on the table. My mother sobbed silently into a tissue. The tea kettle whistled, a shrill, lonely sound in the suddenly vast silence of my kitchen. I turned and poured the hot water into the mugs, my movements slow and deliberate. There was nothing more I needed to say. My son had said it all. After Ethan spoke, the atmosphere in the kitchen changed. The tension didn't disappear, but it transformed. It was no longer the taut, brittle tension of a confrontation waiting to happen. It was the heavy, thick silence of an ending. My parents had arrived hoping for some kind of absolution, a path back into a family they had discarded. But my son, with his gentle, devastating honesty, had shown them that the path had closed 20 years ago. There was no way back. I placed the mugs of tea on the table. Steam curled up into the silent air. They didn't reach for them. They just sat there, two elderly people lost in the ruins of their own choices. I looked at them, and the last vestiges of my childhood fear, the lingering phantom pain of their rejection, finally dissolved. They were not the powerful, terrifying figures who had held my life in their hands. They were just sad. And for the first time, I realized that I had been free of them for years. This moment wasn't about me breaking free. It was about them realizing I was already gone. I sat down, my posture straight, my hands resting calmly on the table. There would be no shouting. There was no need for revenge. I had already won, not by defeating them, but by building a life so full of love and purpose that their judgment had become irrelevant. But there were things that needed to be said, not for them, but for me. For the 16-year-old girl who never got to say them. I looked at my mother, then my father. My voice was as level as a calm sea. "You erased me when I needed love most," I said. It was a simple statement of fact. There was no accusation in my tone, just the quiet weight of truth. I was a child. I was your child, and I was scared. And you threw me into the dark because you were worried about what the neighbors would think. You were worried about the family name. I paused, letting the words settle. For 20 years you never called. You never wrote. You never tried to find out if I was alive or dead. If your grandson was healthy, you didn't care. You only showed up today because you heard I was successful. You read my name in the paper, associated not with shame but with something you could be proud of. I leaned forward slightly, my gaze holding theirs. Now you want to borrow pride from my survival. You want to stand in the light of a fire I built myself after you left me to freeze. You don't want me. You want my success. You want this, I said, gesturing around my warm, solid kitchen. You want the happy ending, but you wrote yourselves out of the story the minute you slammed that door. My father finally looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a desperate, pathetic plea for understanding. We thought we were doing what was right, he whispered. The same tired excuse he had probably been telling himself for 2 decades. We were trying to protect you, to protect the family. This was the core of his delusion, the lie he had constructed to allow himself to live with his own cruelty. And in that moment, I saw it with perfect clarity. No, I said, my voice cutting through his justification, not with anger but with precision. That's not true. You didn't do what was right. You did what looked right. That was it. The final, clarifying truth. Their entire existence had been a performance for an audience of strangers. Their morality was a matter of optics. Protecting the family had never meant protecting me. It had meant protecting their image, their reputation, their perfect white-columned house. The silence that followed was different. It was final. It was the sound of a book closing, a story ending. There was nothing more to say. No argument could be made against that truth. He had no defense left. They had sacrificed their daughter on the altar of appearances, and now, with their appearances in tatters, they had nothing. I watched them. I saw the full scope of their loss. It wasn't just the business or the house or the friends. They had missed everything. They had missed Ethan's first steps, his first words, his school plays, his graduation. They had missed my struggles and my triumphs. They had missed the chance to know their grandson, a kind, brilliant young man who was the best of me. They had traded a lifetime of real love for 20 years of hollow pride. Their punishment wasn't poverty. Their punishment was the emptiness of their own lives, and I felt a profound, aching pity for them. Not because I wanted them back in my life, but because I wouldn't wish that kind of self-inflicted loneliness on anyone. They had chosen the reflection in the mirror over the person standing beside them, and they had been left with nothing but shattered glass. The reckoning had come, not with a storm of rage, but with a quiet cup of tea on a Sunday morning. And it was more complete and more devastating than any revenge I could have ever imagined. They left quietly without finishing their tea, I didn't walk them to the door. I just sat at the table and listened to their footsteps fading down the driveway, the sound of a car door closing, and then the engine starting and driving away until there was only the peaceful silence of my own home left. The past was walking itself out of my life. Ethan came and stood beside me, placing a warm hand on my shoulder. He had been listening from the other room, giving me the space I needed. "You okay, Mom?" he asked softly. I looked up at his dear, familiar face, the face I had first seen in a lonely hospital ward, the face that had been my reason for everything. A slow, genuine smile spread across my lips. I reached up and covered his hand with my own. "I am," I said, and the words felt truer than anything I had ever said. For the first time, I really am. I felt a profound sense of release, as if a weight I hadn't even realized I was still carrying had finally been lifted from my shoulders. The ghosts were gone. The story was over. Through the window, I watched a bird land on a branch of the oak tree in our front yard. The sun was still shining. The cinnamon rolls were ready to come out of the oven. My life was here, in this house, with this boy who was nearly a man. It was a good life, a life I had built not from ashes, but from love. Revenge didn't come as a triumphant, angry roar. It didn't come with watching their world burn. It came as a quiet Sunday morning. It came as a woman with her own house, her own clinic, her own family, her own peace. My father once stood in a storm and told me to erase my mistake. And I did. Not my child. Them. If you've ever been thrown away for the very thing that made you stronger, hit subscribe. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't power. It's peace.